the next few years, we're going to see some big transformations in the global economy driven by Bitcoin.
Hello, and welcome back to the CoinStories podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Brunell, and we are talking to some of the leading voices in Bitcoin, their backstories, how they were first introduced to Bitcoin, and their take on what the cryptocurrency offers. I'm so excited to share my guest today is Max Keiser. Max is a broadcaster, finance commentator, podcaster, filmmaker, and Bitcoin orange pill prescriber. He hosts the Keiser Report, a financial show on the RT network, and hosts the Orange Pill podcast alongside his brilliant wife, Stacy. You might recall Max co-founded the Hollywood Stock Exchange, which allowed traders to exchange virtual securities like movie stocks and star bonds with convertible virtual currency, the Hollywood dollar. Ever since he entered the Bitcoin space, his goal is to help people become self-made millionaires. Here's Max. All right, so thank you so much for joining me. I'm super excited to chat with you. And my first question, I just want to take it all the way back and get a sense of your origin story. So I read that you're from New York.
Yeah, from New York, exactly. That's right. Good. We're off to a good start.
Well, tell me a little bit about your upbringing, because I think, sometimes our views are shaped by sort of our socioeconomic backgrounds and how we grew up and how we viewed money at a young age. So I'm just kind of curious about your background.
Right. So I graduated from New York University and I got a job on Wall Street right away. And I was on Wall Street for 8 years. And then in 1990, I decided to completely change my life. And I flew to Paris and I ended up living there for 5 years. I called in my resignation from a phone booth near the Gare de Lyon. And I sold my book of business on the phone. And I just stayed in Paris for 5 years. And I was just really exploring Europe and Paris and having a great time. Then I sold a screenplay to Miramax in 1995 for a vehicle with Alec Baldwin and his brother Billy Baldwin. That took me to Los Angeles. And myself and my partner from a friend of mine from Wall Street started the Hollywood Stock Exchange in 1996. And so I had to invent a virtual currency, virtual securities, and a virtual market maker to make that essentially a gaming environment with a virtual currency. And I have a patent on a virtual currency, patent number 5950176.
Super cool.
And in 2001, the company was sold to Cantor Fitzgerald in New York. I went back to France, and this time to the south of France. And in 2003, I met Stacy, and we've been just traveling the world and making content ever since. We got involved with Bitcoin in 2011. We had a guest on our show, Keiser Report, who introduced us to Bitcoin. I immediately kind of made the connection to what I was working on previously with the virtual currency market. So we started buying Bitcoin and talking about Bitcoin. At that time, it was about $1. And we have had many of the earliest pioneers of Bitcoin on the show. And I think for about 5 years, we were the only real broadcast network covering Bitcoin. A lot of people around the world first heard about Bitcoin from Keiser Report. We hear from people all the time who got in very, very early and living in countries all over the world.
Yeah.
And really changed their lives. And that's something that's always great to hear, because it really is a life-changing technology, and we're just getting into the sweet spot, I think, right? In the next few years, we're going to see some big transformations in the global economy driven by Bitcoin.
So before we talk a little bit more about Bitcoin, I know that you studied theater at New York University. So when you were young, you weren't interested necessarily in finance. Did you wanted to go into the performing arts?
Well, I was at New York University. I was studying liberal arts, and I was basically into film, television, and radio. So this is my main interest was in those kind of broadcasting and filmmaking. And I did also study theater, really, and philosophy and this type of ancient theater, really Greek theater, as kind of the basis for so much in modern life. Really, you can trace it back to the origins. And I picked up this Wall Street job really as with very little expectations about anything about Wall Street. But the second I started there, I immediately fell in love with it because it was extraordinarily theatrical. Wall Street is basically thousands of stories told simultaneously in the theater called ticker tape. So the ticker tape is just scrolling by, and there's just so many incredible things going on simultaneously. So to be able to be conversant with that and be involved in all these simultaneous stories was really exciting. And at that time, Wall Street was dead. 1982, 1983, Wall Street had just been through a 16-year bear market. And the boardroom, the place where brokers work, was half empty. Brokers were working night jobs to make a living. You couldn't make a living as a stockbroker. And then the bull market really that we're still in started in 1982, 1983. So we've been in this 40-year bull market. So that just was good timing. So within a year, the market just took off in a huge way. And so that was my first job. I was 22, and just like immediately I made a huge amount of money. So that's what enabled me by 1990 essentially to retire or go into semi-retirement, living in Paris, and
amazing.
Stayed there for 5 years. And then my adventures took me to Los Angeles, having sold this script idea to Miramax. And so my philosophy has always been to essentially just let the universe take you where the universe is going to take you. The universe will provide. You just move countries, change everything. It'll all work out.
Well, and just out of curiosity, so many people right now are growing up and they can sense and feel this sort of economic disarray. Maybe their parents lost their business. People are out of work. Education is so expensive. And so there's this awareness that I can't save very easily. I can't afford things as easily as my parents could. When you were growing up, what was the sense of growing up? Was it a lot more comfortable, more stable?
Well, I guess, I grew up really in the 70s, right? So in the 70s, you had stagflation and you had an economic contraction. It was the worst economic environment since the Depression. So in 1974, the market was down sharply. You had the oil embargo going on. Price of gas took off. You had to wait in line at the gas station, the odd plate, even plate. So it was a very tough economic time. Markets were down. And so there was, but the interestingly, the spread between the richest and the poorest in America was at its narrowest that it had been since the 1920s. So in the 1920s, you had the robber baron era, which was an enormous disparity between the top and the bottom. And then starting with the 30s and FDR and the reforms, et cetera, by the 1970s, it had narrowed considerably. Then in 1980 with Reagan, it started to gap open again. So when Reagan came in and we saw the deregulations that came with Reagan, markets started going up in a big way, the bull market. And now we're at a point in 2021 where that robber baron era is back, and the disparity between the top and the bottom is actually wider than it was during the 1920s. It's the widest ever in American history. So that's caused a lot of anxiety and a lot of problems. And this generation coming up, the millennials and the Gen Zs, they are pretty distraught, except for the Bitcoiners. The millennial Bitcoiners that I talked to, that I've interviewed, that I know, are really positive. They're really smart. They feel like they're lucky to be around during the Bitcoin revolution. A lot of them are wealthy. They've been buying Bitcoin for years now, and so the future is bright for them. I think in 5 years' time, the Bitcoin millennial generation will pretty much be the most powerful political bloc in the country.
Okay, well, all of that is so exciting, especially because when we're seeing all this quantitative easing and we're seeing all this money printing, why do you think it's so hard for people to believe that we could see interest rates go back to 15%, that we could see hyperinflation again, and that the US dollar is actually threatened? I feel like I say that, or it's mentioned to people who are very educated and they're like, that can't happen. They won't. The thing I hear is they won't let that happen. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, over the last few decades, the models and the data and the indexes used to gauge economic activity have been warped or distorted or changed. And so the pictures that we get of the economy do not reflect what's really happening. In the case of inflation, the government claims we're at 1.6% inflation. But we know that if you were to actually drill down into the numbers and do an accurate representation of what people are actually experiencing with prices, you find that inflation is already running at 10 to 12%. And if you add in some other factors like Obamacare and et cetera, it's running higher, and the trend is a lot higher. Now, the central bank has come out and said, well, yeah, we recognize that inflation is actually higher than we thought it was, but they're saying transitory. And that's historically what central banks always say at the beginning of an outbreak of inflation, that it's transitory, don't worry about it. But we are pretty certain, I'm pretty certain, that this is the beginning of a breakout in inflation. And we're going to see a lot of carnage in areas like the bond market and the stock market selectively. And people are unwilling to see it because we have a whole generation now, maybe two generations, that have been raised on really, really misrepresentation in terms of how the economy underlying metrics are reported and discussed and are talked about in the financial press, on the mainstream financial press or the mainstream or Wall Street Journal, et cetera. They have all systematically over time adopted this mirage of steady growth without any concern whatsoever for debt. And this is just basically what I would say a slow euthanasia. So the economy has been slowly murdered.
Yeah.
In 2008, actually, the economy did actually die. And it's been kept going with these injections of fiat money to try to create the image of animation that something's going on. It's like a Potemkin village, essentially, the American economy. It's just a facade. It's a hologram, and the risk of that hologram being shut off suddenly is very high. And so people will resist that until it's too late. So it's very difficult for people to change and to plan and to think long term. Most people are thinking very short term. It's very difficult to think 2, 3, 4 years and 5 years into the future. And most people don't bother. And so, but that's what makes a crisis. It happens in a way that no one's really prepared. The US dollar is in a hyperinflationary collapse against Bitcoin right now. That's the signal. That's what it's telling us. But people don't want to hear the signal. People don't want to know the truth, because the lie is very, very comfortable. To be in a comfortable lie, why should I look at the truth? So, but that's what Bitcoin's telling us. Bitcoin is the only asset that's not in a bubble. Bitcoin is not in a bubble. Bitcoin is the pin.
Well, so tell me a little bit more about when you first learned about Bitcoin. You mentioned 2011. Obviously, the price was ridiculously low. I mean, were you skeptical at all at first?
Well, we had a guest on our show, John Matonis, who had invented something called Hushmail, which is encrypted email. And so he, just broke down that this is essentially encrypted money. And it can work outside of a closed environment like a gaming environment, which I had the experience in with the Hollywood Stock Exchange. So it's a distributed digital scarcity. And so I knew from Hollywood Stock Exchange that virtual money works. People use it as a currency, and there's no separation really between the money people use anywhere in a digital dollar or virtual money. People just automatically embrace it, and they get very attached to it. So I knew that, and I was trying to work on ways at the Hollywood Stock Exchange to bridge the virtual currency that I had invented into outside of the gaming environment. So we would have
the Hollywood dollar, right?
Yeah, the Hollywood dollar. So on eBay, we maintain an exchange rate of 1,000,000 to 1, and you were in the gaming environment, but you could go to eBay and cash out at any time for dollars, US dollars. And so I was always looking for ways to kind of cross that gaming threshold into the general economy with it. But the problem is distribution in terms of getting away from a centralized system. And so Bitcoin figures that out. It solves that problem. So I knew right away that it could be huge because it solved this key problem, that it doesn't have to be centralized. So that was the problem I was having with the Hollywood dollar, and the Hollywood Stock Exchange. So that took it from there. So we just started talking about it. And at the time, we had a lot of gold bugs, and we were known to following the gold market. And our gold bug community audience really hated us for getting into Bitcoin. I liken it to maybe when Bob Dylan went electric. They suddenly were like, hey, you're betraying the gold community. And that split still exists today. There's still gold bugs like Peter Schiff or Frank Giustra or the others who are still fighting this battle, the gold Bitcoin battle, many years later. But that's what we experienced at the time. But we went with it because we just had a sense that the way that the community online and around in our audience, the way we broadcast to millions of people around the world, we got so much great feedback from places that were suffering from, the U.S. dollar and all the tricks that the U.S. government plays with the U.S. dollar in various economies around the world. And people kind of picked up on the fact that, hey, this could be a way for us to escape the dollar and the sanctions and the censoring and all the problems that come with the dollar. And they were right, and since we have a global audience, that was great feedback from the audience. Our show plays in 50 different countries, and we get, when we travel to these countries, you just feel it and talk to people that they are so excited about Bitcoin because it separates state from money. It gets away from the U.S. dollar and the U.S. dollar hegemony that's been a problem now for decades. And it gives them individual sovereignty. And the benefits are huge, and it's very exciting.
Just to back up for 2 steps, I'm kind of curious about your sort of your rise in terms of becoming this face in finance news on your show. I mean, how did that all really come about? When you came back from Paris after you sold the screenplay, even before the Hollywood Stock Exchange, I mean, how did you start to build wanting to spread sort of this message about economics and alternative views of economics?
Well, I've always been interested in the idea of perfect money, and as it's a philosophical question as well as a monetary question. And we're even working on Wall Street in my 20s. It was an era on Wall Street of great innovation and experimentation and financial engineering, where because Wall Street was being pressured by the appearance of discount brokerages like Charles Schwab and others, they had to start inventing new products. And it was a very heady environment because you saw executives and financial engineers essentially create out of the stuff of money all kinds of whimsical reinventions of it, derivatives and things that. So you begin to understand that money is essentially plastic. It's clay. It's just something. It's an element you can create anything with it. And it's ancient, and it taps into our unconscious and our imagination, and so this stayed with me since those days. And so in Los Angeles with the Hollywood Stock Exchange, I got a chance to express that by combining the fascination with celebrity in Hollywood with the fascination with trading in stocks and bonds. So I put those two together and created this hybrid in a gaming environment that was incredibly successful. And it invented prediction markets. It was the first commercial prediction market. It's the first prediction market with a patent attached to it. It invented media derivatives. It was the model for David Bowie when he launched his Bowie bonds. David Bowie sold a catalog of his music as a bond. And the banker who put that together, I talked to, and he said, yeah, I kind of got the idea from you guys.
Well, I feel like it's like the original NFTs almost.
Yeah, well, exactly. You know, it's anything can be traded. The underlying issue though is the money itself. You know, I had to invent a new form of money, the Hollywood dollar, which is a digital money, and you have to invent a way to trade it, and then you had to invent securities to trade it with. And so all that stuff was done. But what Bitcoin does is it actually reinvents gold, right? The base layer of gold. So the digital currencies and so many of these alt currencies are really different versions of fiat money. They don't compete with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a reinvention of gold, or a reinterpretation, or a relaunching. It's a substitute for gold as base layer global money. And so that is the quantum leap. That's really an enormous intellectual leap into something that, I mean, I understood when I saw it, the value in it, but all the work that I was doing, though, I don't think I would have ever gotten to that point of making that insight into that design. It's just a fascination that goes back to all of my studies, and even going back to university, because people tend to orient their thinking around valuation and around with the monetization. I have often thought that if you could capture how people monetize their thinking, you know, it'd be very interesting. And with the Bitcoin broken down to the Satoshi level, and with the network expanding into all realms of the economy, potentially we could have people who their thoughts reflect as Satoshis, and the interaction with each other would be via an exchange where we're swapping Satoshis. And the beautiful part about that is, because it refers back to the blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain, we know that every 10 minutes, everything that happened up until that moment would be codified as a permanent record, and there would be no revisionism. So the problem we have a lot is, in our experience here on this planet, is that people are constantly reinterpreting the past. They're constantly revising the past. They're constantly forgetting the past. But here with Bitcoin, every 10 minutes, everything that happened between January 3rd, 2009 and right now is permanently on the record and transparent. So the past is now completely known, and there's no variable to it. So that's an enormous gift, because then we can just focus on the future. We don't have to keep revisiting the past. We just focus on the future. And if everyone's just focused on the future, then everyone is equally mystified and curious about the future. And to unlock a global curiosity synchronistically about the future, which is unpredictable, because the difficulty adjustment is unpredictable, and that's the ghost running the Bitcoin protocol.
Right.
We have the potential for a huge leap, not only in how we see money, but how we see wealth, and then for how we see ourselves. And I think that's coming. So we could see almost a quantum evolutionary intellectual leap that's coming via Bitcoin. And I think hasn't been priced in.
Yeah. How did the Keiser Report come about? Like, how did you actually create that show and get it off the ground?
Well, as I mentioned, in 2003, I met Stacy. I was living in the south of France, and we became a couple, and pretty quickly we started doing content. Stacy has a background in television in London, and as a script doctor. She's an excellent kind of what they call a script doctor, and writer and producer and editor and, you know, director. And so we started to do what, before podcasting was really invented or a thing, we started to do what would become podcasting, and talking about finance, because the stories in the Financial Times that I was reading, I would always point out that this is watch, because there's a story about these derivatives that they're selling right now to this pension fund. Within 2 weeks, there'll be a story, a follow-up story, how in fact they discovered that there was something wrong with this product and that they're going to require a bailout or of some kind. And this would always happen over and over again. Like the financial news is just interesting because it tells people exactly what the criminals are doing. They don't hide it. But it's just an interesting relationship. We seem to, it's like in the US anyway, we have a really romanticized version of criminals. We love The Godfather and The Sopranos, and, we romanticize the crooks. We love a crook and a gangster in America.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that the financial markets are run by gangsters and crooks and money launderers and scammers, on like Jamie Dimon or whomever, Jay Powell, Janet Yellen, these are all gangsters. They're beloved characters because that's the American literary tradition, really, is to love the what we call the anti-hero, or what you might call the gangster, the crook. So we eventually got the attention of a producer at Al Jazeera English who was just launching their TV network, and they contacted us about doing some work with them. We ended up making 10 short documentary films for them for a show that they had on their network called People in Power. That led to a series on the BBC called The Oracle with Max Keiser that we shot in Paris, and we were living in Paris at that time. And then we were watching RT, and we thought, this network really is good. We had been traveling the world for years and doing shows for France 24, Press TV, BBC, and we were really impressed with RT. That they really understand television, really, really well, and they were doing great and building a huge audience. So Stacy just went to their website to info@rt.com basically, and sent randomly a cold email saying, would you be interested in a Max Keiser TV show? And within an hour, we got a response back saying, yeah, we would. And 2 weeks later, we were on the air with the Keiser Report, episode 1. And if you look at it, it's pretty simple. It's just basically me at a desk. And the audience, we already had an audience basically. The audience, it's a good show. It's dubbed into Spanish starting a few years ago, and it's really the most popular of any show. Really, it gets hundreds of thousands, millions of views. Is the Spanish version is dubbed into Spanish of Keiser Report, because we do talk about Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is the currency of resistance. It is the currency of liberation, and in the Spanish-speaking world, in Latin America and Mexico, this message is very, very hot. They love to hear this, and get into it. And when we go to Mexico City and we go to Latin America, the people just follow. They crowd around us. They know us. They just love the show. We are very, very popular in those countries, and we've made a lot of people millionaires in those countries. The message that we do, because we challenge the Church of Wall Street and the Vatican of the New York Stock Exchange, it's considered to be heretical in the United States. So we don't really get huge U.S. coverage. And for that reason, a lot of people in the U.S. who would have also been Bitcoin millionaires today are not, because of the censorship. So because of the censorship in the media space in the U.S., mostly to keep out the competition, if our show was on a U.S. broadcaster, it would be the #1 show in America by far, like John Oliver or CNBC or Bill Maher, these types of shows. We would do 10 times their numbers instantaneously. But that is not something that any of those producers want to hear, because we challenge the current model, right? So it would be super popular, but it would also cause riots. So they're like, no, don't do it. So we're happy with the rest of the world, right? So the U.S. is like, what, 5% of the population of the world? We've got the other 95% of the world. I'll take 95% over 5% any day of the week. So so that's how we started. So we're almost at 1,700 shows. So it's a 1,700 shows over 12 years. Keiser Report. It's the number one show on the network in both English and Spanish. And it's seen by 30 million people a week in English, 20 million in Spanish.
Unreal.
And yeah, so it's the most watched business and finance show in the world. And it's been talking about Bitcoin for 10 years. And then, CNBC just discovered Bitcoin like 2 or 3 years ago. I tweeted Joe Kernan, he's over at CNBC, and he discovered Bitcoin like 2 years ago, and he's all happy about it and excited and stuff. And I'm like, hey, Joe, you should have me on. He's like, no, can't have, we don't want to start a riot. Can't have that. And I'm like, okay, I get it, Joe. Okay, whatever. Yeah, it's too bad media is so messed up in the U.S. Like, that's just too bad. But that's the way it is. But, Bitcoin is censorship resistant. So it won't survive Bitcoin either. All this new media that's coming up, people like Nick Carter, this guy, American Hodl, Pomp.
Yeah.
These people are, in 5 years, that's going to be the media. That's going to be the media.
Can you kind of describe like what is being red pilled and going further than that after the red pill, the orange pill for people that aren't familiar?
Right. So with, the red pill, it's, you're removing the scales from your eyes. You're seeing what's behind the illusion, and, you're woke from the fact that, as we saw brilliantly portrayed in the movie, The Matrix. And with the orange pill, as it relates to Bitcoin, is that we understand that Bitcoin, the red pill phase is that it's separating state from money, it's individual sovereignty, it's unconfiscatable, it's better than gold, it's the best store of value ever, the hardest money ever, it's continually getting harder. We know all these things. The Bitcoin Standard, Safety Moose, his book, brilliant. So from there, you understand that Bitcoin is the monetary network that's going to connect the globe with this Bitcoin standard. So you have that network now of a global monetary consciousness driven by Bitcoin. So the orange pill is really more like on the hallucinogenic side of that. Like, where do you take your mind when you're plugged into the monetary network? So it's like Alan Watts meets Jay Powell, right? You're monetizing your hallucinations. And it's so you were part of the orange pill dream. And so then it's Renaissance 2.0. Well, Stacy talks about that all the time. So you had, which was based on the sound money of the florin at the time with Medici's, and you had an incredible explosion of talent at that time during the Renaissance in Florence, Italy. So Bitcoin is really Florence, Italy, Renaissance, but globally, instantaneously, spontaneously, driven by the hardest money, harder than the florin, harder than any gold. It's the hardest ever. It's Bitcoin, where the past is completely known and transparent and unrevisable, and the future is mysterious without dogma. So then you have the orange pill, which is the cosmic consciousness. You're traveling the collective unconscious. You're able to just go in and out of people's minds freely, using Bitcoin as a unit of account, of a transaction. It's kind of a Jungian, synchronistic, global unconscious monetization of what I believe, in my view, will be the discovery of a greater depth of altruism that hasn't been explored by our species fully. And It's a love explosion. It's like, what if you had an atomic love explosion?
Right.
Love just wipes hate off the face of the earth. So you have to be ready for that. You have to be prepared for that. Prepare for good times.
Well, I mean, what do you think is the biggest myth surrounding Bitcoin? There's so many people that are wary of it. They think it's too volatile. They think it's too late to get in. I'm sure you get asked so many questions about Bitcoin. What's something that if you had to have a 30-second kind of elevator pitch about the cryptocurrency to the general audience that might not understand it? What do you want to debunk?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because the question is always, well, how do you explain Bitcoin to my mom, or my grandma? And that's not really a valid question because, how would you explain the internet to your grandma?
Yeah.
It's going to come and go, and people are just going to make that leap and be in a Bitcoin world, and they won't know how or why. Bitcoin's running on its own vector, and it's I posit that it's self-aware and it's on its own mission, and it's pulling us along with it. And either all of the points that have been used to talk down Bitcoin systematically over time, they're all been shot down. So all what are called FUD, right? The fear, uncertainty, and doubt. The fact that the volatility issue, the energy usage issue, et cetera, all these issues have been addressed now many times over, and there really are no issues left. There's nothing standing between somebody getting Bitcoin and somebody who doesn't get Bitcoin. The only thing standing in the way is fear. People who are fearful or narcissistic don't get Bitcoin because they're full of fear and full of narcissism. People who are more positive and are more humble, they get Bitcoin. And so that's how it's dividing society, not political affiliations or spiritual or religious affiliations. It's dividing society between the curious and the humble versus the narcissistic and dogmatic.
I know you talk a lot about this with your wife on your podcast and on your show. Paint the picture of what the next 5 to 10 years look like as we're shifting already. Central banks are talking about digital currencies. Bitcoin is becoming more more popular. People are more aware of it in terms of the mainstream culture. But you you allude to sort of this clash, right? Where the US dollar essentially fails. And for a lot of people, it's hard to imagine that or comprehend that, and that's not a very good feeling to have. So how do you see the next couple of years playing out?
Right. Well, on the question of the U.S. dollar failing, I think that's a guarantee because over 300 years, no fiat money has survived. They've all gone to zero or lost 99.5% of their purchasing power. So there's no reason why the U.S. dollar would escape that. It's not that the reason why every fiat money is collapsed is the same reason that the U.S. dollar is collapsing is there's too much printing. You can't print something to infinity and expect it to hold any value. And that's what's going on in the U.S. They're printing it to death, as all money printers do. So there's no question that the U.S. dollar is going to collapse. As far as what the future for Bitcoin is and how to look at it, Bitcoin has an insatiable need for energy, and it's going to essentially pull energy away from the central banks. It'll pull energy away from various fiat money. It'll pull energy away from the nation state. So I don't think the nation state as a unit is going to survive Bitcoin. It's going to pull energy away from gold miners. And it's essentially a 51% attack on the world's energy supply. So within 5 to 10 years, I foresee that 51% of all energy on the planet will be used to mine Bitcoin. And in so doing, everything else, well, that could be considered anywhere near competing with it. It could be a central bank digital currency or an altcoin or fiat money or gold. they will all be demonetized, defunded, and disappear.
So you don't see the transition happening where central banks start to issue the digital currencies, maybe China first, since they're sort of in the headlines more, but obviously US dollar over in Europe, the banks start to fail, especially first in Europe. And then we sort of move into this basket of global digital currencies, with Bitcoin being sort of the store of value. Or like, how you don't see an interplay between multiple digital currencies?
As a transition, there will be multiple digital currencies, but they will all essentially go under, because the energy needs of Bitcoin will defund them, and we don't need them, so they're inefficient. The energy efficiency and energy usage is going to become increasingly important, and wasted energy will be weeded out of the system. So right now, we know, for example, Bitcoin's going after stranded energy in the oil and gas market. It's converting flaring gas off from oil wells into Bitcoin. So it's a green industry. Bitcoin is probably the greenest industry in the world, because it goes after all the stranded energy or renewable energy. So it's going to change the petrodollar-dollar relationship dramatically, which is already under fire, already looking fragile. So then the US dollar loses world reserve currency status. Then you have a bunch of, a competition to see, okay, how do we play this geopolitically? And more countries are going to just start to hoard, mine, and accumulate Bitcoin as a strategic reserve. We already see that happening in a few countries. And that makes the price go up. That makes the hash rate goes up. That makes the need for energy go up.
Mm-hmm.
And so as it keeps pulling energy away from all sectors of the economy, but particularly the least efficient sector of the economy is the finance sector. And the energy sector, that's only viable because of the money printing and the inefficiency of Wall Street. For example, the fracking industry in America is cash flow negative. It always has been. It always will be. It's also energy negative. It takes more energy to frack than it does that you extract. The only reason it exists is because Wall Street sells junk bonds to pension funds. And so that inefficiency will get weeded out by Bitcoin. Bitcoin is going to use energy efficiently. And there could be a transitionary period, but the vector that we're on, the path that we're on, would be this, what I call the 51% attack on global energy by Bitcoin. That's what Bitcoin's mission. Bitcoin's got its own mission. Mm-hmm. And we're just kind of the drones that have been now swept into Bitcoin's path, really. We're becoming subservient to Bitcoin in this way. So, which is fine, because at the current model, the current situation without Bitcoin would be, it's a dire situation. You have the biosphere and the ecosystem collapsing, and you have geopolitical risk, and you have monetary collapse, right? There was nothing really on the horizon that looked positive until Bitcoin. So we're fortunate in that Bitcoin came around. Without Bitcoin, you'd have to, that doomsday clock that's been around for decades.
Yeah.
How close are we to midnight on the doomsday clock? And they always push it forward by a minute or 30 seconds or 10 seconds. And we're like 2 minutes before midnight. And when you read stories about Fukushima dumping,
right,
millions of radioactive gallons in the ocean and all these things going on. But I think if they were to incorporate Bitcoin into the doomsday clock scenario, they would have to give us more time. They would have to go backwards and actually give us time. And as Bitcoin proliferates, that doomsday clock is going to start to give us more and more time. The people, whoever runs the doomsday clock, they should, I'm not sure they're aware of this, but nevertheless, they should take this on board. So Where that's without it, I think we really would be facing extinction as a species. And Bitcoin seems to be the only thing between us as a species and extinction. So I think the millennials kind of understand this. The Gen Z understands this, and they're running with it. They are tremendously optimistic. They dodged a bullet with Bitcoin, and they're going to be able to reshape the world, and they'll be the biggest political bloc very soon. So that's hopeful.
Well, thinking about the average Joe in the US who is just so used to legacy banking, legacy media, as we kind of teeter on the edge of this cliff of the monopoly global monetary system, do you think it's going to be a point where you fall off that cliff and literally everyone's trying to at that point secure Bitcoin because the US dollar's failing? I mean, to me that almost plays out like another world war. I mean, this would be like conflict and violence potentially. How do you see it playing out where we make that actual transition?
Yeah, I think it is going to be similar to a war in effect. Instead of scrambling for land or scrambling for weapons, etc., that the scramble will be for Bitcoin. But Bitcoin has a unique attribute in that it is unconfiscatable. So the only way you can increase your Bitcoin position is by offering me something that I'm willing to part some Bitcoin for. So you've got to come to me peacefully, and we can maybe do a deal. So unlike fiat money or gold, which are easily confiscated or easily inflated away, and easily fosters violence and war.
Sure.
War and
Yeah.
violence are the result of gold and fiat money. That's the primary driver of war, violence, and hatred is fiat money and gold. So Bitcoin is actually the opposite. Bitcoin drives peace, faith, love, and it's just really the complete opposite of fiat money and gold. And so it's a war where people are going to be fighting with love. So we're going to have a love war. What exactly that looks like? It's going to look like a Beatles song from 1967. It's going to look like, it's going to look like Timothy Leary meets Alan Greenspan. It's going to be a breakout of peace, love, and understanding. It's going to be an Elvis Costello song.
But, government's greedy. Obviously, they're going to want to try to hold on to their power for as long as possible. Do you see any obstacles that potentially could bring about the devaluing of Bitcoin in terms of being a future global reserve currency? I mean, we obviously know that they can't. They've tried to ban it. They could potentially increase taxes, right? Or unrealized gains. What do you see being the biggest threat to Bitcoin, or do you truly believe there is none?
Well, they're broke. So how are they going to, I think the more likely scenario is that like the US government will offer Bitcoiners a 90% discount on their taxes as a way to get more Bitcoin. Because obviously if they go the other way and they say, we're going to tax you more, then, okay, good luck trying to find me. I'll be gone. I'll be living somewhere else. I'll go to a country that is not stupid. But I think that the U.S. isn't that stupid. I think they'll figure out that they need to make deals with Bitcoiners to try to get as much Bitcoin as they can on their balance sheet as an existential threat that is faced by them from countries that do have a lot of Bitcoin on their balance sheet. This is like the new Sputnik space race moment. The U.S. entered the space race, and we triumphed in the space race. John F. Kennedy made a brilliant speech, and he put some money behind it. The U.S. needs to come to the same moment of truth and say, you know what, we need to start a hash race. We need to accumulate Bitcoin. We need to be the leaders in the Bitcoin revolution. And we're going to do that. We're going, like FDR had the public works program. Joe Biden should start the Bitcoin Works program, which includes tax breaks for Bitcoiners, subsidizing Bitcoin mining, etc. The Wyoming state is doing it. The states in America are already ahead of the curve. So you have Wyoming is becoming a Bitcoin state.
Yeah.
You've got Austin, Texas becoming a Bitcoin hub. Miami, Florida, you can already pay your taxes in Bitcoin. They're making concessions for miners in Miami and Florida. So the states, like they did with marijuana law, they were out front, and eventually at the federal level, the marijuana laws will be passed. Similarly, in the United States, you've got several states who are ahead on the Bitcoin revolution, and they're making their own laws. They're taking a smart approach, and then that'll filter its way up to the federal level at some point. So I just think that this idea that the government is going to be hostile to it is incorrect, because there's nothing they will realize that they have to join it or be beaten by it, right? So I think that the U.S. still, on balance, has a history where our culture is one not of being subjected to and being undermined by the centralization, dogmatic, imperial kind of slave mentality. The U.S. has over time come to embrace the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the things that are in those documents. So Bitcoin fits with the founding documents of the country. It is freedom. It is sound money. That's what. So if the idea is to have America continue into the 21st century, they would embrace Bitcoin. If the idea is we're too fat and lazy to continue, let's just stay in our rooms and shoot smack and die of an opiate overdose, then they won't embrace Bitcoin. But I think on balance, they're going to probably respond to the positivity and freedom of Bitcoin.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about this moment you went viral with Alex Jones and mentioning that you gave him 10,000 Bitcoin on a laptop that he ended up losing. For me, the biggest shock about that is, 10,000 Bitcoin, even several years ago, that's a lot of money. I guess my biggest question is why would you give someone 10,000 Bitcoin? You just have so many you could part with?
Well, at that time, Mike Hearn, who was one of the earliest developers, he gave away 20,000 Bitcoin. Gavin Andreessen, as part of Fawcett. There were 2 or 3 other people known to have given away tens of thousands of Bitcoin. Alex Jones, he doesn't really get all the details correct. This goes back to 2011 or so. The price was under $5, and he says these things were lost, quote unquote lost. That's not exactly how my version of the story.
Okay, tell us your version.
That's his version of the story. Well, we were hoping to use his audience to get a lot of people into Bitcoin, and there was a lot of talk between us. He didn't want to go through with it because he was incredibly paranoid about all kinds of things. He tends to live in a world of paranoia and conspiracy. That's his milieu, right? So he was also into gold. So he couldn't make the leap to, no matter how much, and I've talked to him dozens of times about it over the years. And Peter Schiff too, Peter Schiff at $1. I tried to give him some. He wouldn't take it. Russell Brand in London, I tried to give him some. My friend Alec Baldwin, who I've known for 35 years, I tried to give him some when it was under $5. And he was like, no, that's all your funny money, your Hollywood money.
That's hilarious.
Nobody wanted it. I couldn't give it away. It's just, that's the way it was back then.
But so you transferred him 10,000, he got a wallet essentially that had 10,000 Bitcoin in it?
Well, he tells his version of the events, and he's got his version of the story. The particulars and the details. Now this is 9 years ago. So, all I can say is that one piece of the puzzle that he has a memory of losing this is incorrect. And so, he was on the phone. Actually, we were talking a couple of weeks ago about this very point, But I would don't want to try to reconstruct things from that many years ago. We don't have a lot of supporting documents to go with it, and all I can say is that Alex Jones is not happy about the situation because you're talking about 500-600 million dollars, and but that's not uncommon for the industry at that time, right? A lot of people gave away a lot of coins. The narrative at that time was mostly about payments and less about Bitcoin as gold 2.0, even though all of Satoshi's notes refer to fiat money being printed to oblivion and that how this is essentially gold and the new form of gold. But for some reason, in the early days, you had particularly some of the early startups like BitPay and others, and other other prominent names in the industry were really focused on the payment side of things. And so therefore, even the Bitcoin pizza guy, right? I think he took 10,000 coins in exchange for 2 pizzas. So that's just the way the industry was. It's been a huge roller coaster. So you've had 3 halvings, you've had 3 90% corrections, you've had the fork wars, the hash wars. You've had developers come, developers go. You've had developers leave and start either hard forks with thinly, with the hard forks of Bitcoin. You had people go off and develop what they call the world computer coin, or the whatever the narrative is for Ether today. I don't know. They change every few days, but whatever it is today, that was originally from Bitcoin developers who were frustrated at the pace of development. So they went off and they did all these other projects. So it's just been like 5,000 years of monetary history compressed into 12 years. We've seen everything that you could ever have seen. We've seen it, we're going to see some more stuff. It's very exciting. I think, as I alluded to earlier, this global consciousness awareness spontaneously organizing around the philosophy of Bitcoin, the metaphysics of it, is going to be really incredible. And it's what I call the Bitcoin singularity. It's on the immediate horizon.
Will Bitcoin force China to be free?
Well, I think all nation states essentially dissolve because nothing survives Bitcoin. So countries are going to have different rates of change and find this change, in different ways. The countries that are more agile will be first, and then that'll kind of force others to get involved. And we'll see how it plays out in different countries and different cultures and different political systems. But there's no way to fight it. You can't really fight Bitcoin. So obviously in China, it's very centralized, Politburo style, a political system. And, but they are also sensitive to remaining competitive. So I don't think that they want to go back to being non-competitive, but ideologically aligned. I think they want to be, I think they would prefer to be competitive. So the only way they're going to remain competitive is to adopt a Bitcoin standard along with everyone else in the world. And so that's the exciting thing about this, is that the whole nation state model, which is, it's been around, hasn't been around, how many years, if you go back really post medieval days, you can come up with the birth of the nation state. And, it's a structure that is useful to some degree, but I don't think it's really useful anymore. Central banks aren't useful anymore. So if a structure doesn't have any support, it's going to collapse, and there's no support for it. The U.S. would be a good country for the Bitcoin standard to take hold and for us to dissolve the central bank and then keep some parts of the government, because the government's already somewhat decentralized. The idea of the founding fathers was to create a decentralized government. So they were already aware of decentralization and the separation of powers. And balancing of powers, et cetera. So it's done a remarkable job. Unfortunately, in the last 60, 70 years, it's become overrun with special interests, and you've lost most of the charm of the U.S. as it was originally envisioned. But nevertheless, there is some remnants there that can be dusted off and put back in play. And the Bitcoin would be the perfect way to do that. Hopefully we'll get some, again, these millennials, in another 5 years, they're going to be starting to become senators and congressmen, and, they're going to be entering the political arena, and they're totally Bitcoinized. And that's where we'll see the growth and the hope. So the U.S. 5 years time could be a Bitcoin powerhouse, and which would be nice. I hope that happens.
Well, the Bitcoin philosophy is so much about returning sovereignty to the individual, but actually right now, some of the statistics about the younger generations, the Gen Zers, that they actually are for communism, they actually are for socialism and the state being in control. Why do you think we've gotten to this place where young people think that those types of economic systems are positive, and also that there's this sort of almost politician hero worship? I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I feel like, 20 years ago, people would worship the big celebrities, the George Clooney's. Today, people worship Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and folks like them.
That's news to me.
Really?
I'm not aware of that at all. Everyone I talk to in the millennial and Gen Z are into kind of an Austrian school of economics. They don't like Keynesianism. They like individual sovereignty. They recognize that the current system, even within that group that you speak of, I see that there's huge splits, like Jimmy Dore, who used to be with the Young Turks, who used to be a cheerleader for Bernie Sanders. He woke up to the fact that that's a dead end. And he's got a whole crew of folks now, and in the media and in politics. And that sugar high of flirting with socialism is going to burn off pretty quick. So it's unsustainable. And it's based on an unfamiliarity with what would be the huge benefits of going toward a Bitcoin standard. Once you experience it, there's no turning back. It converts you to what can be a future of getting rid of huge waste, huge inefficiency, huge corruption. I mean, the study that just came out that showed that senators and congresspeople are trading on inside information more than ever before. And it's just such a cesspool. The political class are just so corrupt. And that just stinks so bad. If people can sense that stench, and when you get that stench of the current political class in your nose, you know what that is. You know what that smells like, and you know where it comes from. I think there's some hype around it, what you're describing, but it's not based on actual on the ground kind of the revolution that's going on, really. And that's what makes the revolution always kind of surprising, isn't it? Right? That's why it's a revolution. It's that the status quo was very comfortable with their beliefs and their illusions and their marketing and their crony capitalism. And then one day, somebody wheels the guillotine into the Place Concorde, and there's the reign of terror. So Bitcoin is the guillotine of the millennial generation, except it doesn't need to decapitate anybody, but it will decapitalize everybody who gets in its way.
Maybe it's a Trojan horse.
Well, it is a Trojan horse, yeah, but the Trojan horse is a story that is beguiling and subtle, and but I think that this revolution is going to be sudden And I wouldn't use the word violent because I don't think it's going to be a violent revolution. It's just going to be a sudden leap.
So for people that think it's too late to get into Bitcoin, and they also see things like the stock market and other assets that they could really get more appreciation at this point than feeling like Bitcoin could double or triple, what do you say to the folks out there?
Well, the fiat money is going to be worth nothing. So only keep money in fiat that you're willing to lose. So you only have two choices, gold and Bitcoin. And gold is inferior on many, many fronts. So that leaves only Bitcoin.
Yeah, don't you think there's no person that's more underappreciated for the adoption of Bitcoin than Peter Schiff?
Well, he's just a guy who I think the only conclusion one can make is that he's a masochist, right? Some people enjoy getting publicly humiliated and are masochists. And so that's his shtick. He enjoys wearing the crown of thorns and being ridiculed, and that's his thing. Psychologically, you could do quite a study on this individual because they appear to be quite suffering from many mental maladies. I told him to buy Bitcoin at $1, and again at $10 and $100 and $1,000. I explained it to him very patiently and held his hand. But he's going to be talking the same thing when Bitcoin's at $1 million. He'll be saying someday we'll be going to the graveyard. There'll be a tombstone, and in that tombstone will be a television, and on that television will be a loop of Peter Schiff saying the same stupid stuff over and over again for eternity. And that it'll be the stone of Peter Schiff that never shuts up and never is right and never understood it. And that's his whole life, is being dedicated to being wrong. That's how he'll be remembered. It'll be, I have Schiff for brains. I never understood anything. I missed it at $1 and I never got on, and it went to $1 million. Even my son left me and became a Bitcoiner.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable story. It's hubris. It's again, getting back to Greek theater and Greek tragedy. It's fate. He's fated to be remembered as the worst money manager in history.
That's hilarious. How do you want to be remembered?
Oh, but kind of like we were the first to break Bitcoin globally. Right. So we were the first to take it to the global broadcast airwaves and did so for several years. So we created probably 500,000 Bitcoin millionaires so far.
Well, yeah, something I find really interesting about you is that you talked about the Wall Street, those folks being the gangsters running the world. You have so much experience and you've profited off of learning about that side. And now it's like, do you feel called to give back so that you can help sort of the average person be able to afford a life and take care of their families in a way that hasn't been possible in America in several decades? Do you feel like this mission to get that word out to help people in a way?
I would say I just feel more evolved. As a 22-year-old, 23-year-old, I was really interested in the Wall Street in terms of making a ton of money. And then as I described, I went to Paris and just lived there for 5 years on my wits, essentially. I didn't know French and didn't really know anybody. So I had to just rebirth myself. And then you just have a different perspective. So also living like that, you see how most people in the world really don't have any money at all. Mm-hmm. And yet they are satisfied, they're happy, they live well, they have dignity, which is interesting. And a lot of times when you meet people with wealth, they have no dignity. A lot of times it's really uncomfortable being around a lot of rich people because they tend to be without much dignity. They're kind of petty and conniving and insecure. They need a lot of security, and they're vapid and shallow and not terribly smart. Then it's like, I think Picasso said, he wants to be rich but live like a poor person. And I understand kind of where he's coming from, that with this, is that it's just interesting, the concept of wealth. If you have wealth at the expense of dignity, then you have no wealth.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Coin Stories. I'd love to connect with you if you have